Hi, everyone, and welcome to Café IBTTA. I'm Pat Jones. My guest today is Peter Norton. Peter is Associate Professor of History in the Department of Engineering and Society at the University of Virginia, where he teaches history of technology, social dimensions of engineering, research, and professional ethics. On his UVA homepage, Peter says, "I study the past and the future of urban mobility, seeking ways to improve sustainability, health, and equity. I prepare engineering students to contribute to a more sustainable and equitable future," unquote. Peter is the author of Fighting Traffic, The Dawn of the Motor Age in the American City, and of his latest book, Autonorama, The Illusory Promise of High-Tech Driving. Peter is a frequent speaker on the subject of sustainable and equitable urban mobility and is one of the most popular faculty members of the IBTTA Leadership Academy. Peter, welcome to Cafe IBTTA. It's great to have you with us.
Pat, it's a joy to be here, and I love the chance to talk with you again.
Same here. Well, this is Cafe IBTTA, where we talk about things that are interesting, relevant, uplifting, and fun. And I've got my IBTTA mug here full of some piping hot coffee. And this morning, a special shout out to Malika Setti and all our colleagues at ASICAP, the European Association of Toll Motorway Operators. This morning, they put on an excellent virtual ASICAP annual conference, and I salute you. The content was excellent, and the interface was wonderful also. So we are taking your questions, and we want to get started right away. So Kristen, if we could open up that poll. We have a poll where we'd like people to participate. Okay, there it is. Choose one of the responses to describe your attitude about autonomous vehicles. Oh, wow, it's coming in pretty quickly. Look at that. Look at that, Peter. Huh? Okay.
All right.
Wow. All right. Looks like we've got 105 participants here and 80. We're up to 80 here. All right. I think we'll just let them come in a little bit and see what we have here. All right. It looks like more than a majority. More than 50%, 53% say it's a solution, 15% distraction, and a third not sure. We have a third fence sitters here. Okay. Kristen, I don't know if we can save the results, but it would be great if we could save those results and return to them a little later in the program.
Yeah,
but in the meantime, yeah, Kristen?
Yep, we'll save those, Pat.
Okay, beautiful. So, Peter, I'd like to start with the title of your new book, Autonorama, The Illusory Promise of High-Tech Driving. Let's dig into that word illusory. Tell us about that.
Well, let me start by saying I'm pleased to see that there's that the plurality was optimistic about autonomous vehicles, because I think that makes our conversation more interesting, since I'm relatively skeptical about them. But when I say it's an illusory promise, what I mean is when you promise to somebody in the hope that it will get them to do something, and they follow along and they never quite get there, it's like, pursuing that mirage in a desert that always attracts you because it looks like fresh water and you're a thirsty explorer in the desert. And yet it keeps receding as you approach it. And I think that's a pretty good metaphor for high-tech driving. And I say high-tech driving because, in earlier generations, there were other versions of high-tech driving, and it's kept receding. The promises have always exceeded what we can actually achieve.
When you talk about high-tech driving and the receding nature of those promises, early in your book, you use a couple of words that might be unfamiliar to people. You talk about motordom and you talk about futurama. Let's drill down into those two words.
So motordom is an old word that automotive interest groups used about 100 years ago. It faded out by the middle of the 20th century. And I decided to revive it because it's a much shorter way of saying, constellation of automotive industry related enterprises, which is essentially what it's meant. So it includes the manufacturers, but it also includes the auto clubs, the auto dealers, the parts manufacturers, the distributors, and it can include others like road builders and oil companies. So I found motordom to be a wonderfully useful short term for something that's long and complicated, and I decided to revive it. Because I think it's a useful word. And today, motordom is in partnership with the tech sector. And we don't yet have a word that combines both of those yet, but they are working together, promoting an autonomous vehicle future. And I think you asked about Futurama too.
Futurama, exactly.
Yeah. So the book's title is a fusion of Futurama and autonomous. Put them together and you get Autonorama. And the idea that behind the book, it's really the basic idea behind the book, is Autonorama is Futurama 4. By that I mean, in 1939 and 1940, General Motors had a famous exhibit at the New York World's Fair called Futurama, where they showed us the city of the future. At that time, that meant the city of 1960, or the wonder world of 1960, as they called it. And it was a beautiful, perfect vision of a beautiful future of a city where you can drive everywhere at any time without delay and park for free when you get there. When that didn't work, General Motors had an exhibit at the 1964 World's Fair. So by 1964, it was clear that Futurama 1's vision wasn't really panning out. So they had Futurama 2, which showed the city of the future from 1964's point of view. And so that was 25 years after Futurama 1. 5 years after Futurama 2, we had the beginning of the smart highways era, which I'm sure most of your audience is well acquainted with. In the 1990s in particular, there were ideas that with intelligent highway systems, there would be super efficient, delay-free, low congestion, or even zero congestion, safe traffic flow. That was a disappointment too, and I'm saying that we are now on the fourth iteration of these unfulfillable promises, which we could call Futurama 4, but because it's about autonomous vehicles, I call it Autonorama.
Peter, tell us a little bit more about the mood and the feeling that people would get from being in this Futurama, sort of the tour they get through this building, and what are they seeing and the voices they might hear.
Yeah, so, there's a remarkable consistency, especially between Futuramas 1, 2, and 4. In Futurama 3, some of the showmanship was less conspicuous. But if you'd gone to Futurama 1 in 1939 in New York, first of all, you would have had to stand in a long line because it was incredibly popular. And once you got into this exhibit, you would have sat in a moving chair with a state-of-the-art audio system for 1939 that would narrate to you what you were seeing pass beneath you in a gigantic model, about half a football field in size. And you would stare down at this model from your chair as if watching the future from an airplane window. And you would see this really amazing world while a soothing voice told you that this is the wonder world of 1960. And what you would see from this pseudo airplane window was the city of 1960, where you could actually see all the cars driving around. They went on little tracks and grooves on a track on highways. And these vehicles never had to park anywhere. When they got to the end of the track, they would go down underneath it and come back the other side. So no parking problems. I don't know what the real world adaptation of that would be. But it was a beautiful city where everybody drove everywhere. There were no crashes. They used radar, or what they called radio detection. and divided highways. And the message to the audience was, this is the future. This is where we will be in 1960. In some ways, it did work out that way. We did get a lot of expressways and so on. In other ways, it didn't work out that way because we also got, vast parking lots and traffic jams and actually very high fatalities too.
So Peter, a major theme of your book is auto dependency. And this is the thing that perhaps you're most skeptical about. Talk to us about auto dependency and the thread line through your book about what that means.
I'm glad you asked, Pat, because it's very easy to listen to someone like me and think, well, here's somebody who obviously hates cars or is against cars, and I'm not at all. I think cars were introduced as a useful tool, but along the way, they have been reconfigured as an all-purpose solution. And when that happened, by the middle of the 20th century, we began redesigning our cities and our suburbs around the assumption that everyone is in a car. And then once that assumption is sort of officially embedded in the design standards and the engineering standards, then you end up making places where you can't get around any other way, right? So when you define accessibility as accessibility by a car, then you end up with distances and turning radii and road design that makes it difficult for anyone to get to that destination in any other way. And then we're compelling people, even people with low incomes, to buy an expensive car of their own. And ostensibly, these efforts will ultimately relieve congestion, but of course, every effort to relieve congestion invites more driving, with the consequence that we end up with urban sprawl and gridlock combined often.
Peter, I want to read back to you one of my favorite passages from your book, referring to enforced car dependency and its alternatives. You write, "A critic of car dependency can expect to be misrepresented as an opponent of cars." You're referring to yourself, I think, at this point. "A carpenter who prefers to drive nails with a hammer is not an opponent of wrenches, but a person who appreciates what a wrench is for and what it is not for." Would you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, so I find that carpenter analogy useful because, of course, to a carpenter, a tool is a tool. You can't say to a carpenter, what's your favorite tool? Because the carpenter will say, well, it depends entirely on the job. And that's how automobiles began in this country and in the rest of the world too, as a tool, say a farm to market tool, a Sunday drive in the country tool, a doctor's tool for getting to the patient, a delivery tool. It was not an all-purpose mobility solution. And it has been repackaged as an all-purpose solution. So I think there's a really important distinction between a tool and a solution. And if those things get mixed up, then we get into trouble. This is one of the reasons why I'm a big admirer of Rachel Carson, because she was making the same kind of argument in Silent Spring 60 years ago, when she was saying that actually chemical pesticides are useful tools. But when we mistake them as all-purpose, apply them constantly solutions, then we get into trouble. And it's the same with car dependency.
I'm glad you mentioned Rachel Carson, because she's a recurring figure in your book. And another recurring figure is Elaine Hertzberg. She's the woman who was killed by a self-driving Uber in Tempe, Arizona in 2018. What's the significance of Elaine Hertzberg appearing in your book multiple times?
Well, I mean, first, there's a criticism that invites, that I'm using one incident that, while at the same time, of course, on the same day, probably dozens of pedestrians were killed by conventional cars. And so it'd be easy to take my interest in the Elaine Hertzberg tragedy as a way of sort of skewing and impugning driverless cars. But my actual intention is very different. My actual intention is to use that case to illustrate a really important difference. And that is the difference between what automated vehicles theoretically can do, which is very, very impressive, and I'm as impressed as anybody else, and what they'll actually do in practice. So when I go to conferences and I hear promoters of autonomous vehicles tell us about their performance, it's very impressive. Theoretically, they could, be programmed so as almost never to collide with anything. But the difficulty, and the Elaine Hertzberg case illustrates this, is that in practice, to make the autonomous vehicle that safe, it would have to be programmed to be so cautious that no one would want to pay any money to ride in it. So by that, I mean, every time the vehicle had detected a 1% chance that this is a pedestrian or a child or a cyclist, it would brake. And, the result for us in the vehicle would be, it would be slow and annoying. And so we wouldn't want to pay. And the illustration of this is that Uber, programmed the vehicle to minimize false positives and used a human safety driver to compensate for that, while surely knowing that a human safety driver's attention span for hours is going to be limited. And the consequence was that Uber was really taking chances with the lives of Arizonans. And that's not just me saying that, because, of course, Uber wanted to do this in California, and California said, no, you can't experiment with the lives of Californians. Since the USA is composed of 50 states with a lot of sovereignty, they compete for business, and Arizona then saw its opportunity to lower its safety standards to attract Uber. And I think, the result was a very dangerous scenario that led ultimately to Elaine Hertzberg's death. So I think there's a very fair point to be made about the Elaine Hertzberg case.
Understood. Our guest today is Peter Norton. He's an associate professor of history in the Department of Engineering and Society at the University of Virginia. He's here today talking about his book, Autonorama, and we are taking your questions, and you can post them in the chat. Peter, I have another question for you. The book is certainly a vigorous critique of car dependency and the various versions of that. You are less critical, however, about tolling. You describe electronic toll collection as one of the, quote, few modest successes, unquote, of intelligent vehicle highway systems, what we would now call ITS. Tell us more about that.
So I'm not in the tolling business in any conceivable sense of the term, but as I'm an amateur fan of tolling, because I think it is our chance to reconnect the cost of supplying road capacity to the person who is imposing that cost on society. Tolling can ultimately sort of make roads a service, or access to roads, a service that we pay for the way we pay for other services in a more logical way. And so in what I call in the book Futurama 3, which is the smart highway era of the 1990s in particular, first of all, that smart highways vision was a huge disappointment, frankly. It's not often stated that bluntly, but I stated that bluntly because tens of billions of dollars were spent and not a lot was accomplished relative to what was promised. I think it's often forgotten that the early 90s vision was that by 2000, the cars would be driving themselves on highways. And of course, we got nowhere close to that at all. And the technology that was developed connected with smart highways, most of it was not ultimately implemented, like platooning, for example, but electronic toll collection was. So in 1989, the Dallas North Tollway was introduced using RFID battery-powered tags that let you drive right through the toll plaza without stopping. That was just around Dallas, but in 1991, Oklahoma introduced a statewide Pike Pass for the Oklahoma Turnpike. And since then, we have had, electronic tolling. And while, plenty of aspects of tolling are controversial, and there's plenty of debates going on about what good tolling really means, I think there's a lot of consensus that we can actually connect the cost of the road that you're using with the user. Then we're doing something that is vastly better than the gas tax, which is a very crude, deeply flawed and insufficient mechanism, as I think most of this audience will quickly agree. So I think tolling has been a success. I mean, I'm pleased that New York City appears to be introducing a congestion pricing scheme in Manhattan. And I think that can improve both improve congestion and sustainability and offer us more choices.
Peter, returning to the theme of car dependency, many transportation experts say that Americans prefer driving to other transportation modes, but you argue that we can't know what Americans prefer because most have poor choices. Tell us more about that.
Right. So to my astonishment, if you look in a state Department of Transportation report or a similar authoritative document, you will sometimes see statements like, well, Americans obviously prefer to drive. Just look at the actual modal share that is composed of people driving their own car. And of course, that modal share is typically well over 90%. But of course, if you have a world, and this was a point I made when we were talking about car dependency earlier, if you redesign the world around the assumption that you're in a car, pretty soon most people will be in a car, and we can't tell if they're in the car by preference or by practical necessity. And so I think it's been shown very clearly that when we give people choices, some people will continue to choose to drive and will often have a better experience because other people who would otherwise be crowding the road are now using other modes. There's an app, it's owned by Google, called Waze, where drivers evaluate their driving experience. And the country with the most highly rated driving experience in the world is the Netherlands, which is also the most bike-friendly country in the world, and also one of the countries with the best rail and bus networks too. So I think that's an example we could learn from.
Peter, in your book, you also talk about how car dependency changes the landscape of our urban areas, and it changes the meaning of A to B, that A to B becomes something different from what we thought it was. Tell us more about that.
Right. So when you design a city around the assumption that everyone's driving, well, then this introduces certain new conclusions to your decisions about, for example, where to locate a store, where to locate a residential subdivision, or so on. You can locate them further apart, and at the same time, you then have the authorities, whether it's the State Department of Transportation or other authorities, who are defining their job as reducing delay on drivers. So every time you drive less than the speed limit because of traffic, the experts call this delay, and they equate that with a dollar value, and that dollar value is then to be spent on reducing your delay, with the sort of bizarre effect that you end up encouraging greater distances as you encourage greater speed of driving. So, I mean, there's a very elementary equation that says that the time it takes you to get to your destination is a function of the distance and the speed. And if you obsess on the speed side, which is what the delay formulation encourages, then accidentally you will increase the distances. And so we call this urban sprawl, and then urban sprawl becomes self-perpetuating because of the fact that once it's underway, people feel compelled to drive more because the alternatives get worse as we go along. So it is a kind of a vicious cycle of car dependency that ensues.
It's a little bit of a non-intuitive kind of thing. And another thing that may seem not to be so intuitive is this concept you talk about of risk compensation. and driver's coma. This risk compensation is a phenomenon you describe in which safety systems in a vehicle interact with human drivers in a way that can limit or even negate their benefit. Talk to us about that a little bit.
Yeah, so when engineers or policymakers, regulations make systems safer, there is a tendency for at least some users to translate that safety benefit into a convenience benefit. By that, I mean, to take a simple example, if you put rumble strips on the side of a highway, that's a safety benefit. But if that coaxes people to think, well, I'm extremely sleepy, but I can keep driving because every time I go out of my lane, I hear that rumble. Well, now that person who might have otherwise pulled over to nap is now encouraged to stay on the road. Now, risk compensation is no reason to give up on working on safety improvements. Quite the opposite. But every safety improvement we have taken into account the risk compensation effect. And one of these effects is that the more the driver expects the vehicle to be responsible for the safety of the occupants of the vehicle, the less attentive the driver is going to be. And this effect has been well established for about 40 years.
Peter, we have an interesting question from Jim Kennedy. It's a long question. It has a big preamble. He says that, maybe we'll have some sort of toned down alternative to all vehicles being autonomous. And then he asks the question, what do you think is the proper use of the technology? So
I really like the question because it invites us to recognize that we don't have this binary choice between an all autonomous vehicle future and a no autonomous vehicle future. If we think of autonomous vehicles as tools, well, then suddenly that re-empowers us to ask, well, what's the best use? What's the best job for which to use this tool? And I think that's exactly the right way to go. And certainly, autonomous vehicles could serve a number of excellent niche purposes, delivery of goods, minivans, niche applications like connecting people from the airport to the hotel along a dedicated route. It gets much more complicated when we start mixing in a lot of autonomous vehicles with a lot of human-driven vehicles. That has made the autonomous vehicle challenge so far in Super Bowl is trying to mix the two together. Yes, Waymo does work in suburban Phoenix, but suburban Phoenix is a very particular kind of environment and not necessarily the environment that's the model of sustainability for a future with climate change. But I think the questioner is asking exactly the right question, and rather than answer it for everyone, I would just encourage everyone to ask, if we think of autonomous vehicles as a tool instead of as an all-purpose solution, then what jobs is that tool best suited for?
Kristen, could we bring that poll back again? Because I want to do toward the end of the session, retake of the poll and see if we get any kind of different results. Okay, so here is poll number 2, which really is the same as poll number 1. And we just want to see if there's been any change in people's thoughts about solution, distraction, or not sure. So, all right, we're seeing the numbers come in. We've got about 60 responses so far. And I think the last time through, our solution bar was above 50%. It's hanging right in there. Peter, can you see the poll as well?
I don't see the results. I see.
Oh, okay.
I see only the question.
Only the question. Okay.
Oh, now I see the results.
All right. So, yeah. So we've got. Still happening a little bit. All right. So we're right around 51% at solution, 19% distraction, and about 30% not sure. So not much change, maybe a little change. Maybe a few of the solution people have migrated to other paths here.
Well, to be fair to the audience, it's very tough to answer the question so conclusively as either solution or distraction. And so I guess I'm putting in a word for the not sure people, because of course, it certainly can be a solution to some particular problems. Whether it's the all-purpose solution, though, is another question.
Peter, I'm going to make a couple of announcements here, and then I'm going to return to you for some final words of wisdom. So everybody, don't forget to complete the survey that you'll receive at the end of today's program. I want to tell you about some upcoming events. At 1 p.m. today, we have a webinar on the Infrastructure Act that recently passed the House of Representatives. And this features Rebecca Higgins, the Senior Policy Advisor at the U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, and our own Mark Bieriello. November 16, International Road Safety, Extraordinary Women Taking Extraordinary Action Toward Vision Zero. This is presented by the Women in Tolling Council. November 18, Blockchain Demystified, Ins, Outs, and Applications, presented by the Young Professionals Council. On December 2nd, we have IoT, Security Challenges, another webinar about security. December 9 is our book club with the Task Force on Diversity, Social, and Racial Inclusion. The book is I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness by Austin Channing Brown. And watch the IBTTA website for further updates about all of our events. And please don't forget to complete the survey at the end of today's program. So Peter, back to you. What final words of wisdom do you have before we sign off today?
I'm going to call them final words. I'll let others decide if there's any wisdom in them at all. But here are some final words to think about. There's a proverb: fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me, because I should know better by now. And I'm proposing in this book that we've been fooled more than twice. And it's time for us to learn from that experience. If we recover our history, we have a lot of lessons to learn from it. And I think the lesson in this case is that our choice is not between an autonomous vehicle heaven and an autonomous vehicle hell, as it's sometimes been framed. In other words, which one is it delivering to us? We can escape that trap if we recognize that the choice about what to use autonomous vehicles for is up to us. They are tools in our hands to use for the purposes that we judge best for them. And that will be, I think, the key, that is recognizing them as tools and not as all-purpose solutions to getting the autonomous vehicle future right.
Our guest has been Peter Norton, Associate Professor of History at the University of Virginia. His new book is called Autonorama, The Illusory Promise of High-Tech Driving. You can get it wherever books are sold. Peter, thank you so much for being our guest today. It's been a pleasure. And
it's been a great pleasure, Pat. I'm going to work in one other word. The publisher, Island Press, tells me that if you choose to purchase the book directly from them, islandpress.com, and you type the word webinar into the a box on the purchase screen, they give you a big discount. I can't remember what the discount is, but it's a big discount. And so, of course, you can also choose to buy it from any other retailer that you like, online or otherwise. But I did want to work that in. Beautiful. Peter, thank you so much for being with us. And to all the IBTTA members, be safe, keep in touch, and we'll see you down the road. Thanks, everybody.